What just happened in the Strait of Hormuz may be the start of a much bigger crisis. The US blockade is no longer just a threat. As of April 15th, Trump said it is now fully implemented and enforced. But this is not a total closure of every ship moving through Hormuz, and that distinction matters. The current US move only targets ships going to and from Iranian ports and coastal facilities through the strait. Neutral vessels headed elsewhere are still being allowed through. So how did we get here? The answer starts with diplomacy failing. After the peace talks in Islamabad stalled, the center of gravity shifted from conference rooms to choke points. On April 11th, two guided missile destroyers, the USS Frankie Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, moved through the strait, a clear signal that enforcement was being physically staged. 2 days later, on April 13th, Washington turned that signal into policy, formally launching the blockade. By April 15th, the administration said it was actively enforced, but instead of backing down, Tehran answered with a threat of its own. Iran signaled that it would challenge the blockade and warned that any attempt to lock it out of Hormuz could trigger a direct confrontation in the strait. However, Trump warned that if Iranian fast attack boats approached the blockade, they would be eliminated. That is not diplomatic language. That is the language of a live confrontation. The operation is backed by more than 10,000 US personnel, more than a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft spread across Hormuz and surrounding waters. So when people hear blockade, this is what it really means. Not one ship stopping another ship, but a layered military screen built to intercept, deter, and, if necessary, escalate the situation. US Central Command says 8 merchant ships turned back after the blockade was enforced. That may sound like a small number, but symbolically it is huge. Because once ships start reversing course under military pressure, the crisis has already moved beyond rhetoric and into real-time control. At the same time, the blockade is not absolute. Reuters reported that some vessels still transited the strait because they were not bound for Iranian ports, including a US-sanctioned China-linked tanker. After this escalation, oil pushed above $100 a barrel, and major outlets began framing the move as a live threat to global energy stability. However, this blockade also creates a trap for Washington. If the US reacts too hard to a provocation, it risks widening the war. If it reacts too softly, it risks looking weak and inviting more tests. That is the strategic burden now hanging over the blockade. Announcing a blockade is one thing. Sustaining it in one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world is something else entirely. Because once enforcement begins, the crisis stops being about speeches and starts being about split-second decisions at sea. The whole operation rests on whether the United States can impose pressure without losing control of escalation. And Washington is already signaling it has planned for that contingency. US officials say roughly 50,000 American troops are on heightened alert across the Middle East, and the administration has been moving additional forces into the theater, building a surge option that, in a worst-case spiral, could scale far higher than the naval screen you're seeing in Hormuz. That's also why America's closest allies are stepping carefully. Britain has refused to join the blockade, arguing its priority is keeping the strait open and focusing on defensive tasks like minesweeping and maritime safety rather than enforcement against Iran. France has taken a similar posture, pushing discussions toward a future, non-belligerent navigation mission that could escort shipping and clear hazards after hostilities stop, rather than signing onto the blockade while the confrontation is live. That tells you something important. Even close US allies see the active blockade as a deeply escalatory measure. They are willing to think about securing maritime traffic after the current confrontation. They are not willing to become part of the coercive enforcement phase now. So while Washington may be leading, it is not leading with a fully unified coalition behind it. That matters, because relative isolation makes the political burden heavier if the crisis widens, and the rest of the world is already reacting to this. South Korea is moving to secure alternative crude and naphtha supplies and is trying to protect ships tied to the region. Japan has launched an energy support fund aimed at cushioning the broader shock in Asia. Europe is already planning around post-war shipping security. Oil traders are repricing risk in real time. Central bankers are warning about a possible supply shock. This tells you the world is not treating this as a temporary headline. It is treating it as a live maritime disruption whose consequences may outlast the immediate military phase. Washington is not trying to weld Hormuz shut in the most blunt possible way. It is trying to rewrite the rules of movement around Iranian-linked maritime trade without openly breaking the entire system for everyone else. That makes the move more sophisticated, but it also makes enforcement far more complex. With a total shutdown, the rule is simple: nothing moves. But with a selective blockade, every ship becomes a judgment call. Destination, cargo, ownership, routing, paperwork, insurance trail, flag state. That means every vessel passing through the region is no longer just a ship. It becomes a political and military question. And in a tense environment like Hormuz, complexity is not stabilizing. Complexity creates room for miscalculation. And this is where the physical reality of Hormuz itself becomes so important. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes are even narrower now. In waters that tight, distance is not measured in comfort. It is measured in reaction time. That is why Hormuz is such a uniquely dangerous place for a live blockade. Geography compresses politics into minutes, and minutes into mistakes. And in a crisis built around choke points, pressure rarely stays trapped in one place. And that is exactly why Saudi Arabia is so worried. Regional reporting says Riyadh is pressing Washington to lift the blockade because it fears the crisis could spread westward into Bab el-Mandeb, the narrow passage at the mouth of the Red Sea. You see, Bab el-Mandeb is not some side route on the edge of the map. It is one of the maritime gates that links the Red Sea to global trade and protects the export routes Gulf states depend on when Hormuz becomes unstable. And Saudi Arabia has a very specific reason to worry right now. Its east-west pipeline, which runs across the kingdom from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, is back at its full 7 million barrels per day capacity. That means Riyadh once again has a way to move huge volumes of crude away from Hormuz, but that advantage only matters if the Red Sea stays open. If pressure in Hormuz is answered by disruption at Bab el-Mandeb, then Saudi Arabia's main fallback route stops looking like a safety valve and starts looking like the next target. And this is where the Houthis enter the story. The Houthis are aligned with Iran and are widely described as part of the broader axis of resistance network that Tehran uses to project pressure through regional partners. They have already attacked commercial shipping in and around the Red Sea, forcing rerouting, driving up insurance costs, and disrupting one of the most important trade corridors in the world. That history matters now, because if Iran cannot easily break the US blockade in Hormuz, one of the most effective ways to answer may be through the wider network around it. And that means the Houthis become a ready-made spillover mechanism. That is what makes the Saudi angle so revealing, because Riyadh is not reacting to rhetoric. It is reacting to geography and precedent. Saudi planners understand that one disrupted choke point is a crisis. Two linked choke points under simultaneous stress is something worse, a system shock. And if the Houthis start threatening Red Sea shipping again on Iran's behalf, then Saudi Arabia is no longer just watching a blockade in Hormuz. It is watching the possibility that the entire maritime workaround it depends on could come under pressure at the same time. That is the nightmare now sitting behind the public headlines. And once that possibility opens, the whole map changes. What began as a US attempt to choke Iran's maritime access now threatens to become a contest over the broader energy corridor from the Arabian Gulf to the Red Sea. Hormuz on one side and Bab el-Mandeb on the other. And between them, a chain of tanker routes, insurance costs, export alternatives, and political anxieties that tie the Middle East directly to Europe and Asia. That is why the market reaction was so sharp. The fear is not only that the blockade hurts Iran. The fear is that Iran answers in ways that make the wider maritime system less governable. And that is also why the China angle matters, even if this is not about China in a direct military sense. China has long relied on Iranian oil as one piece of its wider energy flexibility. US officials are already criticizing Beijing's behavior in the energy market during this crisis, and any tightening of Iranian flows reduces China's room to maneuver. Even if the blockade is designed around Iran, the downstream consequences land on major importers too. That means this is not just a Gulf dispute. It is a move with implications for the wider Asian energy system. This is also why Europe is already thinking about what comes after the blockade. Britain and France are not refusing to help because they think Hormuz is unimportant. They are refusing to join because they understand how hard it is to contain escalation once a blockade begins in a choke point like this. That is why they are already talking about a future maritime security mission focused on navigation, coordination, and restoring confidence after hostilities. And this should tell you how serious the current-day scenario really is. This is no longer just a dramatic confrontation between the US and Iran. It is a struggle over whether one of the most important maritime arteries in the world can still function under war conditions. And there is another layer underneath all of this. For years, Iran's ability to threaten or influence Hormuz has been one of its strongest geopolitical cards. The strait was not just a waterway. It was leverage. It was psychological pressure. By moving to block ships tied to Iranian ports, Washington is not just trying to cut revenue. It is trying to flip the psychological script. The message is that the United States, not Iran, will now determine what can move and on what terms in the maritime approaches connected to the Gulf. That is a serious challenge to Tehran's long-standing image of coercive influence in these waters. But if that challenge is going to hold, it has to survive the messy phase. And the messy phase is exactly where asymmetric powers become dangerous. That is why the next days matter more than the announcement itself. Will Iran probe the line with boats? Will shipping companies start avoiding the area even when they legally can pass? Will insurance rates rise faster? Will Europe accelerate plans for a post-war mission? Will the fear jump from Hormuz to Bab el-Mandeb and turn one choke point crisis into two? Those are the real questions now. Not whether the blockade exists. It already does. The real question is, what kind of system emerges around it? So, what do you think will happen? Would this blockade actually lock the strait down for Iran? Or does it corner Tehran into testing the line harder, faster, and more dangerously? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and see you in the next one.